The Surfer arrival into SFO carries approximately 170 flights per day, arriving mostly from Los Angeles, San Diego, and Phoenix. This is in comparison to 230 flights per day on the Diamond arrival from the east, 160 per day in the northern Bodega corridor, and 40 per day western Oceanics. Out of the 170 Surfer flights, about 80 fly down the procedure, and 90 get vectored. Out of the 90 that get vectored, about 50 come back and overfly Los Altos in a different direction, and the other 40 are vectored so far towards Portola Valley that they bypass Los Altos altogether and proceed directly to Palo Alto. Out of the 160 Bodega flights, about 50 use the over-the-bay visual approach, and the other 110 are vectored over land. Some of the 110 turn short over Palo Alto, and the rest turn over Los Altos. Vector traffic is a mixed bag. It is louder, but it is also dispersed. In Los Altos, vectored Surfer flights appear almost identical to Bodega and Oceanic arrivals. In fact, if you live in Los Altos and see an airplane below 5,000 feet, it is almost certainly not a direct Surfer flight. It is either a vectored Surfer flight, Bodega, or Oceanic. Given all of this, the obvious question is, what happened over Los Altos on March 5th that caused the complaint rate to skyrocket the way it did? There are a number of possible options we want to look at. Since Surfer carries the most amount of traffic over Los Altos, we'll start with it and get back to the vector traffic later. Option number 1. Are the Surfer planes flying lower? The answer is yes, but not by much. Sky Posse Los Altos figured about 600 feet average drop in altitude, and we get a similar number. Most of the drop is due to the elimination of the 5,000-foot Menlo altitude restriction that was used for visual approaches and has nothing to do with the Surfer Big Sur issue. However, as the posse also notes, a 600-foot difference is only responsible for less than 1 dB worth of noise impact. So clearly, this isn't it. Option number 2. Did the Surfer ground track shift? The answer is, again, yes, but not by much. At Rogers House, right under swells on the border between Los Altos and Los Altos Hills, the ground track shifted by 3,300 feet. Since traffic flies at 6,000 feet there, the shift brought the planes closer by about 1,000 feet. Now, 1,000 is more than 600, of course, but still, this is about 1 dB worth of impact. Unlike the simple drop in altitude, however, and this is subjective, having the planes fly directly overhead is much more aggravating to the human brain than having planes fly closer to the horizon, even though a noise monitor will never pick up on that. Aside from Roger's clear right not to have a flight route moved to fly over his head, a look at the map shows that Big Sur had a much larger footprint of non-residential houses under it. Objectively, it affected less people in Los Altos. Compared with the Summit and Santa Cruz, the ground track is a relatively small portion of the problem in Los Altos, but Los Altos will benefit when the ground track is shifted back. Option number 3. Are there more Surfer planes flying overhead? The answer is absolutely not. The planes might seem more numerous because they're louder and more noticeable, but Surfer carries the same amount of traffic and the vectoring ratio hasn't changed. As evidence, consider this tally from the FAA feasibility report. The right columns show the amount of unvectored airplanes. For Los Altos, we should also count Menlo vectored airplanes as unvectored since Menlo is downstream from Los Altos. Clearly, there's hardly a change. If anything, the graph shows slightly less planes flying the procedure, which is the exact opposite of the concerns raised by Sky Posse Los Altos. This might strike some people as impossible, but historical perception of quantities is very unreliable. Personally, I used to live under the Big Sur track in the Cupertino Hills, and looking at the data, I am amazed at just how many planes overflew my house. The brain simply does not tally what it doesn't perceive as a nuisance or a threat. Option number 4. Are the Surfer planes more concentrated? The answer is, again, absolutely not. A simple look at the graphical representation is very telling. These snapshots are taken directly from the FAA feasibility report. Clearly, the pattern remained unchanged. An extreme zoom-in on the main tracks shows that the Big Sur was, for all practical purposes, every bit as concentrated as Surfer is today. I should note that the no concentration observation is only for the portion of Surfer that is downstream of Waypoint Skunk. The early high-altitude portion of Surfer over Carmel Valley and Monterey Bay was cleaned up, but even there, the effect of concentration was not more than 30%. Option number 5. Are the individual planes louder? Absolutely yes. Returning to the sidetrack view, it is absolutely clear that a good segment around Waypoint Swells, covering Los Altos and Los Altos Hills, is under a prolonged stretch of level flight at 6,000 feet. And that's the biggest difference between pre- and post-next-gen flight. Similar stretches occur over the summit at 8,000 feet and over Happy Valley at 10,000 feet, and even there it is highly noisy. Once off the OPD procedure, pilots are not very adept at winging a quiet descent profile. What we get is a worst-case combination that is as loud as vector flight, but as concentrated as procedural flight. Using noise monitors, we have identified many instances where identical aircraft flying at identical altitudes less than 1 hour from each other differ by as much as 10 dB. These variances are much higher than anything that can be caused by other options covered above. So regarding Surfer, the conclusion is simple. It is in Los Altos' best interest to support restoring the Big Sur flight track and to support OPD flight. But what about the vector flights, the bodegas and the oceanics? These are a bit more complicated. Overflying Los Altos are about 60% of the vectored Surfer traffic, about half of the bodega flights, and a quarter of the oceanics. And unlike the mainstream Surfer flights, those are highly variable, so the answers are harder to come by. We know, for example, that vectored Surfer traffic sometimes flies over Los Altos and sometimes flies over Portola Valley, bypassing Los Altos altogether. How far planes are vectored depends on how much time the controllers need to delay the planes by, and this is a matter of circumstance. We know that the length of the bodega U-turn depends on how much traffic is on Surfer. The more congested Surfer is on a particular time of day, the further south bodega and oceanic flights have to fly before the controllers find an empty slot to merge them into. The amount of airplanes in a pattern is also influenced by how many planes use the over-the-bay visual approach, which is in turn influenced by how many planes are on the eastern diamond arrival. Longer U-turns are particularly problematic for Los Altos, since not only are the planes flying overhead, but they also arrive at their final altitude too early, bottom out, and then fly level during the U-turn. The impact from these vector flights is also exacerbated by the new emphasis of 4,000 feet at Menlo. In trying to understand what is causing these shifts, we run into three main problems. First, we don't have visibility into the mechanisms that control the vectoring patterns. Second, because of the variability, it is difficult to pinpoint when in time these trends began. And third, because of the impact of Surfer, it is difficult to even estimate the magnitude of the problem. Because of these, we're not able to come up with concrete solutions to the vectored flights. We do think that some of the effects will be mitigated in the midterm future as technologies such as time-based flow management get incorporated into the system, since it will reduce the stress during peak periods of traffic. The issues pertaining to vector traffic can be better addressed in a second phase once we understand more about vectoring and once the effects of Surfer are out of the way. Pursuing this is a much more constructive approach for Los Altos than pursuing proposals to shift Surfer eastward, since the only way to understand and solve the noise problem is for all the advocacy groups to be adamant in requesting the elected to assist us. Fixing Surfer is only the first step. Impact from jet noise has been minimal in the past, and with new technologies the impact should be minimized even further. This is the only way forward.